Well, good afternoon or morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Developing the Passport Learning Outcomes and Proficiency Criteria for Critical Thinking. I'm Kate Springsteen, Project Coordinator of Member and Education Services for Interstate Passport. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available at www.wichi.edu/passport/webinars by tomorrow, March 3rd. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please type your question into the question box on the GoToWebinar panel and it will be brought to the presenter's attentions. Following this webinar, I will be sending out an email with information on where to find the recording, as well as a link to a survey which we would very much appreciate if you would fill out. I'm delighted to introduce you to our presenters for today's webinar, Paul Disney and James West. Paul Disney teaches business management at Western Oregon University and is the Faculty Senate Vice President. Previous to these positions, he served as a U.S. Army aviator and retired after 30 years of active service with the rank of colonel in 2010. He is a graduate of Elizabethtown College and holds a master's degree in business administration from Boston University. Paul attended the Army War College and graduated with a Master's of Strategic Studies in June 2002. James West has served as a chair of the Arts and Humanities Division at Leeward Community College since 2001. He is also chair of Leeward's General Education Committee. Previously, he served as Faculty Senate Chair. James received his BA and MA in Philosophy from the University of Hawaii. Welcome, Paul and James.
Aloha, everyone. Welcome to the Interstate Passport webinar.
Hey, Paul here. James and I were part of a larger team who developed the learning outcomes and proficiency criteria for the critical thinking general education area. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of how we did that, I will give you a brief overview of Interstate Passport. Interstate Passport began as a grassroots effort by academic leaders consisting of 50 faculty and administrators from 15 states who came together to examine ways to facilitate transfer of lower division general education courses between states and regions. Most states do have internal articulation agreements for transfer inside their state, but there is nothing for students transferring between states. This group came up with a concept on how students could block transfer lower division general education courses between states based on learning outcomes and proficiency criteria developed through multi-state faculty negotiation. This group also determined that tracking student academic progress after they transferred with a passport was important for quality assurance. Interstate Passport's overarching goals are simple. Eliminate unnecessary repetition of academic work after students transfer, improve graduation rates, shorten time to degree, and save students money. And it's important to note that Passport was designed by faculty, registrars, and academic advisors focused on quality and streamlining pathways to graduation. These are the major components of Interstate Passport. The two areas we will cover today that you see highlighted on the slide are how we developed the Passport learning outcomes and proficiency criteria for critical thinking. There are 9 knowledge and intellectual skill areas that were developed by 74 faculty from 2- and 4-year institutions from 7 states in the Wichi region. There will be more detail on who these were in an upcoming slide. These 9 areas were developed by building upon faculty-driven work completed by the American Association of College and Universities LEAP Essential Learning Outcomes. There are a large number of institutions who have already adopted the LEAP learning outcomes on their campuses, so this should make the process of accepting or finding congruence with Passport learning outcomes that much easier going forward. The first 3 are the foundational skills: oral communication, written communication, and quantitative literacy. The next 4 are what we call the knowledge of concept areas: natural sciences, human cultures, human society and the individual, and creative expression. The next 2 are cross-cutting skills: critical thinking and teamwork and value systems. These skills cut across all or most of the disciplines in a typical lower division general education program. We will be covering the critical thinking skill today. James will now walk you through the next 4 slides.
Aloha. What we basically did is try to create a passport learning outcome and a proficiency criterion which would show that a person met the passport learning outcome. For instance, we have if we take a look at the oral communication student learning outcome, it's to be a critical receiver. This means they can listen and critically evaluate a speaker's central message and use of supporting materials. That would be an example of what we would call a passport learning outcome. Secondly, then, we would develop a passport proficiency criteria, which would be some statement of an assignment currently used by faculty within the various states that participated for a student to show transfer level proficiency with the PLO. So for example, for critical receiver or listening, they would be able to complete appropriate constructive peer evaluations and summarize a speech's main points. In the next slide, you'll see what we looked at. Faculty from 7 states, about 12 of us, from many different disciplines. We discussed the critical thinking passport learning outcomes, and we will discuss these in more detail later. This slide shows the basic principles that we were in agreement anyone who has a critical thinking learning outcome should be able to do. Okay, so these are the faculty who contributed in the critical thinking learning outcome and proficiency criteria development from the 7 states represented in blue on the slide. They come from a diverse disciplines, including business, humanities, social science, law, etc. These are the colleges that were represented at that meeting and who were ably participating in these discussions on the basis of what they brought back from the discussions at their colleges.
Okay, Paul back here. The process for writing passport learning outcomes and proficiency criteria began at the intra-state level. Each state had meetings of 2- and 4-year college faculty where they came up with mutually agreeable passport learning outcomes and proficiency criteria for their state. These were then submitted to the LDGE passport staff. LDGE passport staff then compiled all in-state learning outcomes and proficiency criteria into one crosswalk document for use by eventual interstate teams. Faculty from the 7 states then gathered in Boulder to negotiate and develop a consensus draft of their assigned passport learning outcome. In our case, critical thinking. The interstate teams then returned to their states to obtain peer faculty feedback on draft learning outcomes and proficiency criteria. Then up to 4 conference calls were used by the interstate teams to further negotiate peer faculty input into the draft learning outcomes and PCs. And then finally, a passport review board was also used to monitor feedback and provide quality control for editing and redrafting. One of the key tasks our critical thinking team accomplished was to obtain consensus on a definition of the critical thinking learning outcome. Some of the key terms we agreed on that helped drive the learning outcome development process were, firstly, critical thinking is an iterative cross-disciplinary process. Critical thinking is also a habit of the mind, and the purpose of critical thinking is to arrive at a judgment, decision, or conclusion. James will now walk you through the intrastate crosswalk that was assembled by the LDGE passport staff.
I like to think of this as going back thousands of years to the great philosopher Confucius, who said we needed to rectify names so that we could ultimately find our way to the truth. Because we all do critical thinking, but as we looked at it, and this chart shows you what was submitted by the 7 states present. So overlapping and different words to describe relatively the same thing. Some people describe it as identify a problem. Some people say identify an issue. Some people say propose a solution to a problem. And the areas that are marked or highlighted in yellow were areas that the group sort of wanted to talk more about. And though we selected from various states their statement here, the final outcome of our discussions was not based on any one state, but the collaborative work of all 11 faculty members from the diverse divisions that met, bringing to this meeting the diverse views of the people from their own state and campuses. We found the work relatively arduous at first, and eventually, though, we passed through the crosswalk and came to draft what we would call the PLOs for critical thinking, which we'll discuss in more detail later on. We also had follow-up conference calls in which we discussed what we had drafted and whether the wording that was used in the drafts was appropriate. You'll see this on the next slide. Oh, here it is. Okay, and on May 11th, we basically finalized, after these months of discussion, basically from the time the crosswalk was first developed until the time, May 11th, maybe 6 months, 7 college committees in the college and the people meeting in person at Boulder, then going back to their college and talking to people on their college again, and then finally coming up with the final description. In the next slide, I'll show you what we came up with as the Passport Learning Outcomes for critical thinking. We basically thought there were 6 features to competent critical thinkers. And our goal is that if students are doing this kind of work in various places, in various courses, we would be able to say, hey, they have met this student learning outcome for critical thinking. So number 1, identify a problem or question and its component parts. This is what the student's project or work will be, or assignment or dossier or whatever works different teachers assign to do this. Secondly, they would recognize and assess personal and other relevant underlying assumptions. So they would be able to see whether assuming this is really a good idea or is assuming this kind of speculative, and what would they have to do in regard to the assumptions they make. We would hope they would ultimately come to look at good assumptions that support their work. They would then gather evidence and analyze the information to address the problem or question. They would evaluate the information for credibility, bias, reliability, validity, and relevance to whatever it was that they are using to demonstrate their ability to think critically. Finally, they would also be able to put this in a context to identify relevant to their field. Are they in a business field? Are they in a government field? Are they in a nonprofit? Are they dealing with a religion and a context within some kind of theological viewpoint? Are they taking a philosophical point of view? Should they be skeptical or not about some of the stuff that they're reviewing and evaluating? And finally, they would develop the logical conclusions, solutions, and outcomes that a faculty member would say was an informed and well-reasoned evaluation. And this would be basically the student learning outcomes, passport learning outcomes as we call them, the PLOs, that students would do. So we met basically again in September, several months later, to work on proficiency criteria. So we developed the passport learning outcomes, and then we asked ourselves, what kind of assignments or work would a student do to show that they met the passport learning outcomes? And we call these proficiency criteria. We developed these. Paul will talk about this process a little bit later. On November 10th, once again, we came back to our respective campuses, spoke with the faculty at our campus and whatever procedures people use. For me, in Hawaii as general education chair, I was able to bring together people working on our college learning outcomes in the area of critical thinking and see what they were doing here on our campus and how that was progressing. And I shared with them what we were doing in Boulder and with Wichita. And then we had another team conference call to complete the PC draft. By December 3rd, we had our final conference call and finalized that we were comfortable with the competency proficiency, passport proficiency criteria that were developed.
I think this is a great time for questions.
All right. Thanks, James and Paul. I do have a question. It says, I would argue that all of our courses cover critical thinking. How do you decide which courses are included in that section of the passport block?
Paul, would you like me to answer that?
Yeah, I think that sounds good, James.
Well, we can both say something about it, but this question exactly came up. In fact, almost every faculty member at our college claimed they were doing critical thinking, right? So there is a widespread acceptance of the fact that part of college teaching is to teach students to critically think in various subject matters. So we had a survey that we spread out to our faculty as part of our accreditation processes, in which we asked them who is basically can contribute assignments that demonstrate they're doing critical thinking. And many people submitted stuff. And after reviewing all of this, we selected basically, we understand this is cross-cutting. It goes across almost all disciplines, and almost all faculty think they're doing it. So our specific passport block, which I will show you later on, was the faculty members who actually provided acceptable examples of work that demonstrated they were really not only speaking critical thinking to our students, but asking students through either examinations or papers or other kind of work to demonstrate that they had actually done this.
I would just add to that, James mentioned the passport block that we're going to get into later, but typically courses can count for more than one of the passport learning outcomes. So you can double count in some cases. It's as long as you have the assignments in that particular course where students demonstrate they have met that proficiency criteria. And again, we'll going to discuss that in a little more detail later, but it can double count in your passport block.
Yeah, the temptation in making the passport block is to think you have to solve the total problem. There's going to be enough diversity across the various systems that will enable students to demonstrate they can think critically. What we're trying to get away from is that some college somewhere, we don't have one, but some colleges in the United States may have a course called critical thinking, which may be part of their core. And what we're trying to get around is a student hasn't taken that course and transfers and is required to take that course, even though they've met the student learning outcomes perhaps in many, many different courses in the college. So that's why it's a cross-cutting skill. It's very, very widespread. Thank you for that good question.
All right. Well, I don't have any more questions at currently, but if anyone in the audience does have questions, please type them into the questions box on the GoToWebinar panel and it will be brought to James and Paul's attention.
Well, that's a good segue into the next slide in terms of proficiency criteria. The development of proficiency criteria modeled the same process used for developing passport learning outcomes to include meetings at Boulder, receiving and negotiating peer faculty input, and conference calls. It is important to note that this is where academic freedom remains absolutely intact. Proficiency criteria are examples only, not requirements. Faculty have the freedom to determine what assignments they use to have students demonstrate they have met the learning outcomes. As you can see, there are a wide range of formats that can be used to include, but not limited to, written, oral, visual, performative, individual, group, etc. Here are some of the proficiency criteria that our team developed for the critical thinking learning outcomes. It is important to repeat that these proficiency criteria are examples only. As you can see, we have quite a wide variety of assignment examples to include business case studies, analysis of Plato's Republic, exploratory essays, just to name a few. James?
Okay. Would you like to become a passport institution? And how would you do that? You would review the passport learning outcomes for congruence. Your faculty would do this on your campus with whomever on your campus would be invited to participate in this group. Eventually, you would construct an institution passport block, and I'll show you our critical thinking block in a minute. The passport blocks for almost all of these various learning outcomes are available at the WICHE website. You would apply for passport status and sign a MOA, a Memorandum of Agreement with WICHE, which would govern basic rules. You would inform and advise students on your campus. Not everyone would be doing this, but there would be some procedure to do this by counseling, by mail-outs, by emails to students saying, hey, we got some good news for you if you're going to transfer. In our two-year college, many of our students want to transfer, and they don't want to lose credits when they transfer. Finally, WICHE, after reviewing your application and the agreement of the signing of the MOA, would invite you or award you a passport status. Your students then would be tracked when they transfer to other schools to see what the academic progress they have compared to students native to your school and vice versa. In fact, one of the real strong points of the Interstate Passport system is a tracking system done by professionals to see how students do who have the passport compared to students who lacked it. Finally, this is an example of a passport block. As previously mentioned, almost all faculty think they do critical thinking, and they probably do to some extent. We at our school wanted to select a variety of courses that clearly do this, and they mirror the way we would do our core requirements. Courses in social science, in the humanities, in natural science, in business and economics would all be illustrative of the place where students would for sure be looking at obtaining critical thinking proficiency. So this was our list that we developed, and of course many of these can be double dipped. So the world history would also cover other segments of the passport, and same with the world religions and the logic courses and the oceanography courses. So that's it for the passport block that we developed.
Well, one of the most important aspects of the passport is quality assurance. Students must achieve a minimum grade of C in all passport block courses to receive the passport. All Passport institutions, as we mentioned previously, have to track student progress of students they receive with the Passport, and the Passport institution will receive a progress report on the students they transfer out with the Passport to enable them to evaluate the quality of their Passport block courses. The Passport Review Board will monitor the program for efficacy of learning outcomes and proficiency criteria. And Rutgers University School of Management and Labor Relations will conduct research on the impact of Passport on transferring students. Colorado, Montana, New Mexico, and the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems are conducting a pilot program to map assignments to Passport learning outcomes. James?
Why become a member of the Interstate Passport Network? Most colleges accept many students who transfer from within state and across state lines. This passport would eliminate a major obstacle to transfer student success. Primarily, students wouldn't be asked to take a course in which they already achieved the learning outcomes because the receiving institution doesn't have a course of the same name and number as the sending institution, even though both courses do fundamentally the same thing in terms of learning outcomes. This would eliminate the necessity for review of lower division GE course changes in articulation agreements, which are somewhat cumbersome. Do you have a course numbered like this? Does it have the same name? So we don't have common course names and numbering across the United States, but we do the same thing in various ways with the same goal of producing a well-educated, well-formed human being. The process focuses on the quality for positive impact on completion rather than merely a name and a number to a course. It's based on what students should learn and be able to apply. It generates data on academic success after transfer, and it provides data for use in continuous self-improvement of all of our colleges. And that is our ongoing task in higher education. We adapt to higher education's changing landscape, and we embrace assessment determined by department, program, and institution, which also includes non-course based educational experiences. This is a way to serve students, serve your college, and serve our country, and maybe even the world in a better way, especially targeted at the students, the hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of students who get credits at more than one college or university in the course of their college education. So I highly recommend you become a member.
So do I. And matter of fact, to make it easier for you, here is a link to resources for your use in developing the Passport at your institution. And I especially like the faculty handbook. I used it extensively here at Western Oregon University when we developed our Passport block. And, oh, by the way, got it approved through our faculty senate, which was interesting to say the least. But I think that's it. I think we're ready for some final questions. And also on this slide, you can see contact information for James, myself, and Kate. And with that, final questions.
All right, thanks, Paul and James. I have another question. In one of the previous slides, it said to become a Passport member, our institution needs to review the PLOs for congruence. Does this mean our institution needs to adopt the Passport learning outcomes?
I'll take that one first, James.
Okay.
Absolutely not. Certainly, you're looking for congruence because it's really the purpose. Your university learning outcomes are for the purpose of assessment, whereas the Passport learning outcomes are designed especially and only for transferability. So again, you're not having to change or adopt your learning outcomes at your institution based on the Passport learning outcomes.
I agree. I think that was a pretty good answer. The my concept, or our concept at Leawood, is basically each school's integrity of their own curriculum and core is intact. We're basically saying students have met the core requirements, or what we call the lower division general education requirements, in other places through a curriculum that might be slightly different but has achieved the same purpose. And we don't want to make them repeat taking courses that they've already basically acquired the skills or the learning outcomes that those courses impart. Paul, anything else?
No, I guess the one thing I left out, though, is, again, your university learning outcomes, as everyone's well aware, not only assessment, but also related to accreditation. So that for that purpose, obviously you wouldn't be changing your learning outcomes, in my mind, to try to match the passport learning outcomes.
All right, thanks, guys. I have another question. What challenges did your team face when developing the passport learning outcomes and proficiency criteria?
Go ahead, James.
Okay. When you have, I mean, in the previous slide you saw the crosswalk that was developed. When we all came together at first, it looked like, my God, we were talking Babel. We got so many different words and voices to support so many different things that it took us a while. I think I was somewhat surprised at our beginning sense of, oh my goodness, this is going to be a really big task. And the crosswalk and the faculty involved were so helpful in basically saying, yeah, this is something that we can use different words to develop, but we could also find some common words. And I think that process in the passport learning outcome meetings was successful because none of us had a sort of a specific something that we were defending, as maybe on our campus when we want to change or expand say this course meets the global studies requirement and this course might not. We have a lot of people who have invested a lot in that specific course or subject matter. And we didn't have any of that territoriality at this meeting. So territoriality, I think, is a problem on your particular campus, but in our development of the passport learning outcomes and proficiencies, it was actually an advantage because all of us looked at what we were doing and found it valuable for students, valuable for the college, and we didn't have this kind of territoriality that, oh, you can only do it in this way, or you got to do it with this course, or we do it better in natural science than social sciences. We didn't have any of those issues. We just went right to the problem, and I think we came up with a very satisfactory solution to all the participatory institutions. Paul, you want to add anything to what I said?
I think you really hit the nail on the head, James, in terms of, being from different states, different institutions. We didn't bring the politics and the turf battles that you typically find on campuses. I know nobody else has experienced that at their institutions, but I think we all got along exceptionally well because of that. We're able to find common ground because of that factor that sometimes doesn't happen on your own campus.
All right. Thanks, Paul and James. I do not have any more questions at this time. So I'd like to thank the two of you again for your presentation today, and thanks to everybody who joined us on the call. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Aloha, Kate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate.
Thanks.